This episode is based entirely on logical reverse deduction. Its point of departure lies in a cluster of anomalous phenomena surrounding the Yu Menglong incident. The interpretations of these anomalies circulated and amplified across Chinese language media and social platforms, contributing to their mystification and the subsequent spread and evolution of these interpretations within the broader Chinese linguistic and cultural context. In the previous episode, What Led to Yu Menglong's Death, we introduced the concept of the blood chamber. Before proceeding, it is necessary to clarify what this term signifies within the analytical framework of this series. The blood chamber is a structural hypothesis developed throughout this investigation, referring to a suspected core circle embedded deep within the entertainment industry. Unlike the more commonly discussed unspoken rules, this inner layer is conceptualized as a closed system sustained by extreme binding mechanisms in which entry is effectively irreversible. Its internal logic can be understood as resting on several mutually reinforcing principles. At its foundation is the creation of strong binding relationships through irreversible acts, such as so-called bloodstaining, comparable in function to a gangster-style blood oath of complicity, or other forms of participation of equivalent gravity, including involvement in planning or direct witnessing, which push individuals into structural dependencies from which withdrawal becomes practically impossible. Built on top of this is a multi-tiered proxy structure, in which different layers assume distinct roles. Some interface with the power core, others manage planning, and still others carry out execution. This arrangement disperses responsibility, isolates risk, and obscures any direct line of accountability to the center. At the same time, a continuous deterrence mechanism enforces compliance by marginalizing or removing individuals who become aware of the system yet resist its binding logic, thereby generating a chilling effect that reinforces discipline across the broader industry. Over time, a cyclical reinforcement dynamic emerges, in which each act of risk containment functions as a new round of screening and binding, allowing the structure not only to persist, but to consolidate and strengthen itself. In this sense, the blood chamber represents an extreme evolution of pre-existing weak binding systems, such as informal exchanges of interest, reputational leverage, or compromise-based control. Its formation and endurance stem from the structural demands of the prevailing power system over the cultural and entertainment sectors within which it operates under implicit protection. Under the sustained influence of this mechanism, China's entertainment industry has progressively drifted away from market-oriented logic and has instead been reshaped into a functional extension of the propaganda apparatus. Within this framework, the influence of public figures is neither autonomous nor organic. It is strictly bounded by predefined limits and ultimately subordinated to a single center of power. Against this backdrop, the Yu Menglong incident was not an isolated tragedy, but a highly coordinated, long-term operation. It was likely planned with precision by the blood chamber and carried out with high-level approval. Its core strategy can be summarized as control first, then wait for the opportune moment. During this waiting period, a parallel process unfolded in which symbolic and narrative groundwork was carefully laid, often through mystical or ambiguous imagery, so that when the final act occurred, it would appear diffuse and difficult to decode. The objective was twofold: to minimize operational risk while maximizing the deterrent effect across the industry. At the same time, a contingency framework for managing public opinion was almost certainly prepared well in advance. The essence of this framework lay not merely in suppressing discussion, but in redirecting it, guiding public attention away from verifiable facts and into the self-perpetuating labyrinth of conspiracy narratives. Once discourse is absorbed into this black hole, competing explanations proliferate, clarity dissolves, and the underlying mechanisms of power remain effectively concealed in plain sight. October 7th, 2020, the starting point of the plan. On October 7th, 2020, Yu Menglong posted on Weibo, "Please, can you stop following me? I'm really scared." This was the first and only time he expressed fear so openly in a public setting. Within the analytical framework of the blood chamber, this moment marked a decisive inflection point. It transformed him from a high-risk variable that could still potentially be absorbed or managed into an uncontrollable element, one who might expose systemic secrets and therefore had to be neutralized. He ceased to be a manageable risk and became an unpredictable liability. What followed reveals the level of coordination operating behind the scenes. Within just 10 minutes, the post was reframed by public relations channels as an incident involving a deranged fan, and this unified narrative was rapidly disseminated across multiple platforms. The speed, consistency, and scale of the response demonstrate an unusually high degree of resource mobilization, pointing to a system capable of acting with both precision and overwhelming force. At that time, Yu Menglong remained under contract with EE Media and still retained measurable public influence. Any direct move against him would have carried significant risks. It could have triggered public backlash, created contractual disputes and financial liabilities, and made it difficult for the agency to distance itself from responsibility. Under these constraints, an immediate resolution would have been strategically costly. Consequently, the strategy of control first, then wait for the right moment, emerged as the most rational course, one that prioritized containment, risk reduction, and long-term planning over hasty execution. 2020-2022, Control, Planning, and Waiting Phase. By August 2021, Yu Menglong's contract with EE Media had formally ended. However, his work trajectory suggests the shift had already begun earlier. From June onward, assignments gradually decreased, though some continuity remained due to unfinished projects. Entering 2022, the downward trend became more pronounced. In August of that year, he signed with Blue Media. In retrospect, this move appears less like a fresh start and more like a continuation of controlled repositioning. The delay in final resolution likely reflected broader political considerations. The year 2022 coincided with the 20th National Congress, a highly sensitive period during which political stability took precedence. Any operation carrying potential risk would have been strongly disincentivized or postponed to avoid introducing uncertainty at a critical moment in the political cycle, particularly one closely associated with Xi Jinping's consolidation of authority. This context suggests that the timing of subsequent actions was not arbitrary, but aligned with higher-level priorities, and that the overall arrangement likely operated within a framework that benefited from corresponding degrees of institutional support. During this phase, mechanisms of control intensified while remaining largely invisible. Close personal oversight, restricted movement, and narrowing professional options became increasingly evident, alongside indications that access to external recourse, including law enforcement, had been effectively neutralized. After joining Blue Media, Yu Menglong's workload declined sharply, yet the proportion of his appearances tied to state media, particularly CCTV, increased. This shift is structurally significant. CCTV maintains high entry barriers and is widely regarded within the industry as a prestigious platform, with appearances on major events such as the Spring Festival Gala framed as markers of peak recognition. At the same time, it operates under strict content control, clear political alignment, and a relatively closed production environment. These characteristics make it effective not only as a channel of visibility, but also as a mechanism of containment. Within this system, exposure became highly curated. Gala-style programming tends to reach a more limited, often older demographic, with relatively low secondary circulation across other platforms, while compensation remains comparatively modest due to its non-commercial orientation. In contrast to his earlier career trajectory, which combined market-driven projects with periodic participation in state-aligned productions, Yu Menglong's activities during this phase appear increasingly concentrated in controlled, symbolic roles within a state-centered framework. This created a deliberate, perceptual gap. To fans and outside observers, repeated CCTV appearances could be read as signs of career recovery or advancement. In reality, his operational space was steadily narrowing, autonomy was eroding, and earning capacity was diminishing. The divergence between public appearance and actual circumstances reflects a sophisticated strategy, maintaining an illusion of normalcy while quietly consolidating control. 2023 to 2024, tight control, reduced exposure, and the initiation of symbolic groundwork. By 2023, as Du Chang's surveillance over Yu Menglong intensified, the blood chamber moved beyond mere containment into a more deliberate phase of narrative construction. Physical control was now accompanied by the gradual deployment of symbolic groundwork, designed to create a future smokescreen capable of absorbing and redirecting public interpretation once the final event occurred. This marked a critical transition, from simply managing risk to actively shaping meaning. A central element in this phase was the web drama A Love Story of Oiled Paper Umbrella, literally a single umbrella in the misty rain, co-produced by Motion Pictures and iKai, which began filming on June 9, 2023, and wrapped on August 9th. Preparatory work had clearly started well in advance. When considered alongside Yu Menglong's earlier major works, Eternal Love, literally 3 lives, 3 worlds, 10 miles of peach blossoms, and 2 worlds, the titles form a suggestive 3-2-1 sequence. Although largely unnoticed at the time, this pattern was later amplified after the incident, providing symbolic scaffolding for the emerging sacrifice theory. Certain lines and motifs within the drama later took on heightened significance. Most notably, the phrase, "A whale falls, all things are born," carries strong symbolic weight and became one of the key narrative anchors in post-event discourse. By mid-2023, Yu Menglong had not taken on any new major drama roles for nearly 3 years, consistent with the hypothesis that EE Media had halted new project arrangements following his October 2020 Weibo post. After his death, the widespread claim that he had been shelved for refusing inappropriate demands from a female investor aligned almost perfectly with the 2020 timeline, raising the possibility that this narrative itself functioned as a post hoc rationalization. On December 15, 2023, another project, Offering Fish, co-produced by Youku, Galaxy Cool Fish, and Ben 2 Pictures, entered production. While seemingly unrelated, its title and thematic elements were later drawn into the same symbolic field, particularly given the phonetic overlap between Yu Menglong's surname Yu and the word fish. Around the same time, preparations for Jackson Yee's 2025 Quay Schwartz Rocky Mountain concert tour were likely already underway. The scale and complexity of its stage design, choreography, and layered symbolic elements would have required a long development cycle. From a communication standpoint, such a high-profile production carried a distinct advantage. It combined massive visibility with interpretive openness. In the event of an information vacuum following a major incident, this pre-constructed symbolic framework could serve as a subtle guide, shaping interpretation without imposing a single explicit narrative. 2025, Execution of Elimination and the Diffusion of Symbols. By 2025, the operation had entered its final phase, where execution and narrative diffusion began to converge. In October, a Douyin content creator claimed to have made an earlier prediction in April, stating that a Weibo influencer with tens of millions of followers would soon face serious trouble, though it might be avoided if his new drama succeeded. As with most such claims, its significance emerged only in retrospect. Its spread relied less on verifiable evidence than on subsequent reinterpretation. We have analyzed this type of prediction separately, showing how it functions to reframe the event as a seemingly inevitable, fatalistic outcome. On April 30th, 2025, Salted Fish Ascends began filming in Hengdian, drawing moderate attention through early casting reports. In June, Jackson Yee's concert theme, Kuei Jue, was officially announced, sparking widespread curiosity as netizens searched for its pronunciation and meaning. Promotional materials followed in July. On August 1st, the studio launched the Kuei Jue Mud Mountain Project, inviting fans to bring soil from their hometowns or other meaningful places to the venue. This participatory element triggered a surge of interpretations centered on the 5 elements: luck changing and fortune balancing. The studio responded by attributing the project to Jackson Yee's personal interest in clay sculpture and his desire to create a collaborative artwork, releasing photos of him holding a clay figure. This pre-promotion ensured that even non-attendees became familiar with the concert's key visual symbols. As the tour launched in early August, with stops in Shanghai, followed by Beijing and Chengdu, the performances themselves reinforced these motifs. Structured into ritual-like acts and incorporating shamanic, fire, and earth symbolism, the show featured soil from across the country being piled together, evoking imagery reminiscent of ancient imperial sacrificial practices. While some audience members recognized the ritualistic elements, most interpreted the event through the more familiar lens of personal fortune and luck adjustment. On August 16th, Offering Fish premiered on Youku. Adapted from a web novel, its storyline, death, ascension, offering and return, added further thematic resonance to the evolving symbolic environment, and by early September, it had accumulated substantial viewership. Taken together, these dramas, the concert, online narratives, and audience participation formed a dense and interconnected symbolic field. Whether by deliberate design or structural convergence, their timing produced a layered interpretive environment in which later events would not appear in isolation, but as part of an already unfolding narrative, one where meaning could be guided indirectly without ever being explicitly defined. September 8th to 10, 2025, Execution of Elimination. September 8th and 9 coincided with the blood moon period, a detail that would later be heavily amplified in retrospective interpretations. According to accounts such as Wang Yuchen's diary, assuming its authenticity, Yu Menglong was taken under control on the 8th and subjected to prolonged sexual assault. In the early hours of September 10th, he was allegedly thrown from a building in Beijing's Sunshine Upper East residential complex, brought back upstairs around 6 a.m., and died several hours later. Shortly after 5 a.m. on September 11th, a resident walking a dog discovered a body lying face down in front of Building 18 with no signs of life. That same evening, despite having been dissolved for some time, his studio issued an official statement claiming that Yu Menglong had died from an accidental fall while intoxicated, and that no criminal liability was involved. At this point, the Kuei Jue concert was still generating significant public attention. Beginning on September 11th, a wave of videos and audio recordings, allegedly from the night of the incident, spread rapidly across the internet. Much of this material crossed the firewall and reached international audiences, accelerating global visibility and making narrative containment increasingly difficult. Mid-September 2025, Closure, Official Framing, and Narrative Consolidation. On September 16th, Joe Pin posted a brief Weibo message. "A whale falls, all things are born." A week later, He Zijie, a fellow native of Urumqi who claimed to have met Yu Menglong, used the same phrase in a memorial post. Given Joe Pin's long professional overlap with Yu Menglong and his appearance on circulating association lists, the timing and wording appear far from coincidental. Within the symbolic environment already established, this phrase functioned as narrative closure. Echoing lines from a love story of oiled paper umbrella, it reframed the death within a deterministic, almost ritualized structure, shifting attention away from concrete causality toward inevitability and abstraction. The same day, Jackson Yee's studio issued a legal warning against rumors, specifically targeting interpretations of the concert as a ritual or luck-changing event. Rather than quelling discussion, the statement produced the opposite effect. By highlighting the very interpretations it sought to suppress, it amplified curiosity and extended the topic's lifespan, a classic case of backfire through denial in communication theory, while simultaneously establishing formal legal distance. A clear divergence emerged between intended symbolism and actual reception. Elements such as the clay figure could be interpreted as an offering or symbolic substitute, yet most audiences defaulted to familiar cultural frameworks centered on personal fortune and luck adjustment. This illustrates how interpretation is shaped by existing cognitive schemas. More complex or unfamiliar symbolic layers struggled to take hold, while dominant readings gravitated toward conventional explanations. Later that evening, Jackson Yee conducted his first live stream in 8 years. Lasting under 20 minutes, it consisted almost entirely of him silently stacking stones, with only brief opening and closing remarks. The stream drew over 13 million views. Its timing, roughly 5 to 6 days after the reported death, attracted attention, and many viewers linked it directly to the concert's symbolic framework. The repetitive act of stacking stones likely evoked completion or ritual sealing, reinforcing earlier motifs. Yet its ambiguity opened the door to multiple, often conflicting interpretations. As the live stream drew renewed attention overseas, new readings proliferated, including speculation about hidden signals or personal distress. This illustrates a broader dynamic. Once symbolic interpretation becomes decentralized, it is difficult to steer it back toward a single coherent narrative. Also on September 16, the studio, despite having been dissolved in July, issued a statement in the name of Yu Menglong's mother, calling for restraint and a return to normal life. Its authenticity was widely questioned, yet no verification was provided. On September 20th, Beijing's Chaoyang Public Security Bureau released an official notice concluding that the death resulted from an accidental fall while intoxicated and ruling out criminal liability. Notably, the notice devoted more space to addressing rumors, detailing specific cases, categories of alleged misinformation, and related enforcement actions. By this stage, 2 parallel narratives had taken shape, an official account centered on accident and closure, and a diffuse, symbol-driven alternative fueled by speculation and fragmented evidence. The former lacked credibility for many observers. The latter, however, became the more influential track, absorbing attention and complicating efforts to arrive at a clear, evidence-based understanding. On September 22nd, authorities launched a targeted campaign against content deemed harmful or destabilizing. While controls had already been in place, this action intensified deletions and algorithmic suppression. Nevertheless, public attention persisted, and international engagement continued to grow. Responses to public inquiries, whether through hotlines or written appeals, followed highly standardized scripts, consistently redirecting individuals to the official notice without addressing substantive concerns. Within a few days, a subtle but significant shift in information management became visible, from total suppression to selective containment. The gaps created by restricted information did not remain empty. They were gradually filled by pre-existing symbolic narratives that offered ready-made frameworks for interpretation. On September 26th, Salted Fish Ascends wrapped filming, with a release planned for the following year. While no direct causal links can be established, the temporal and thematic proximity of these works, a love story of oiled paper umbrella, the Kuo Shui concert, Offering Fish and Salted Fish Ascends, contributed to a layered symbolic landscape. Viewed together, they form a loose sequence, earlier works as prelude, the concert as focal point, and later, productions as extensions. The result is not a single coherent narrative, but a dense field of overlapping associations. Among them, the concert remains the most immediate and sensory element, serving as the primary bridge between symbolic construction and public perception. Late September to early December 2025, cross-border public opinion manipulation. Starting from September 30th, once the name Yu Menglong had become a sensitive term under the Clean Cyberspace campaign, a highly unusual pattern began to emerge across multiple official background Weibo accounts. Entities such as the People's Daily Science account, Hangzhou Westbrook National Wetland Park, the China Meteorological Administration, and the Jiangsu Zhenjiang Ecology Bureau, began embedding the three characters Yu Menglong directly into otherwise unrelated posts. Notably, depending on context, the name itself can be read literally as in the haze or within the mist. This dual semantic function allowed it to be inserted into otherwise ordinary sentences without breaking grammatical structure while still carrying an unmistakable referential signal. As a result, phrases such as, "May you see the direction clearly in the haze," "a wooden bridge hidden in the haze," and "misty rain pavilions veiled in drifting fog," appeared linguistically natural on the surface, yet felt subtly dissonant in context, creating a layered ambiguity that invited interpretation while avoiding explicit statement. Although each sentence remained grammatically correct, the insertion of the name created a noticeable semantic dissonance and felt conspicuously unnatural. Once overseas Chinese media identified this pattern, the phenomenon spread rapidly and triggered widespread discussion. From a structural perspective, such coordination is highly unlikely to be coincidental. It aligns more coherently with a deliberate public opinion guidance strategy aimed at overseas audiences, serving as preliminary groundwork for the subsequent large-scale release of symbolic imagery. In a single move, this approach fulfilled multiple functions. It tested public reaction and cross-border transmission intensity, introduced interpretive ambiguity that diverted attention away from concrete evidence, and subtly seeded a symbolic framework for later expansion. At a moment when early leaks were already directing attention toward the upper levels of power, the repeated and unusual insertion of Yu Menglong into official channels opened an alternative interpretive pathway. Speculation began to shift towards narratives of internal power struggle. Meanwhile, overseas Chinese language media further amplified more symbolic and metaphysical readings. Given the cultural receptivity to such frameworks, and building on earlier layers of symbolism, these narratives appeared organic, while in fact following a loosely guided trajectory. This phase effectively established the cognitive conditions for the next stage of narrative expansion. Mid to late October 2025, concentrated release of mystical imagery. By mid-October, the process entered a more intensive phase, marked by the concentrated emergence of highly symbolic and ambiguous imagery. A blurry screenshot dated September 11th, 2021, began circulating widely, featuring the phrase, "Heaven's Mandate, 4 years from today, Menglong ascends," claimed to be a rediscovered Jihu post by He Zijie, it was quickly treated by overseas Chinese language outlets, including those associated with Falun Gong, as independent evidence supporting the sacrifice theory. However, as noted earlier through probability analysis, the likelihood of such a precise prediction emerging under these conditions is extremely low, pointing instead to post-hoc construction or the possibility of controlled release. Around the same time, the exhibition Yoshitomo Nara, The Void of Silence, which had opened earlier in March 2025 at the Red Brick Art Museum in Beijing's 798 Art District, was suddenly reinterpreted, with particular attention given to a configuration described as a red rope-binding shoes formation. Concurrently, images of an alleged artwork supposedly made from Qiaorenliang's remains began circulating online. By late October, the Genesis Art Museum near the Bulgari Hotel released images of fish-headed human sculptures and similarly unsettling works. Some pieces were presented as newly revealed, others as rediscovered, but all appeared within the same tightly clustered time window. Despite their differences, these artifacts share a common semiotic function. They evoke themes of recording, sealing, and display, motifs consistent with post-event documentation. As these images were circulated and interpreted by overseas Chinese media, they significantly intensified the atmosphere of symbolic ambiguity surrounding the Yu Menglong incident. Notably, all of these venues are located in Beijing and operate within a state-regulated cultural system, where content dissemination is subject to oversight. This context suggests that the timing and clustering of these symbolic releases were unlikely to be accidental, and instead contributed to the expansion of an interpretive environment characterized by abstraction and ambiguity. When viewed together, these developments reveal a coherent pattern of public opinion dynamics. From the initial testing of the Yu Menglong keyword in official channels to the subsequent concentration of symbolic imagery, the sequence unfolded in close temporal alignment with the Clean Cyberspace campaign. During this period, information within domestic channels was heavily filtered, while fragments that reached external audiences gained disproportionate visibility due to their scarcity. This asymmetry created favorable conditions for cross-border narrative formation. The function of the Clean Cyberspace campaign becomes clearer in this context. Rather than operating merely as a tool for suppressing destabilizing narratives, it can be understood as part of a broader informational strategy, creating controlled vacuums, shaping the trajectory of overseas discourse, and allowing externally generated interpretations to circulate and eventually re-enter the domestic information space in a filtered form. In this sense, suppression and diffusion are not contradictory, but structurally complementary. This sequence also reframes the blood chamber hypothesis. It is not best understood as a rogue, extra-systemic actor, but as a mechanism embedded within the existing power structure. Its role, under this interpretation, is to function through layered proxies that distribute responsibility, obscure direct lines of attribution, and preserve the invisibility of the core while maintaining operational effectiveness. Within this artificially constructed environment, a self-reinforcing mystical ecosystem quickly took shape. Interpretive frameworks, from esoteric systems like Chimendunjia to conspiracy narratives, spiritualist readings, and media-driven speculation, coexisted and competed. In such a fragmented yet symbolically saturated space, explanations that offered emotional coherence and narrative closure gained a clear advantage, regardless of factual grounding. It was under these conditions that the sacrifice theory spread with remarkable speed. This pattern is not unusual. In environments marked by informational opacity and institutional distrust, conspiracy narratives often function as cognitive substitutes for unavailable truth. By framing Yu Menglong as a figure whose death carried symbolic or transcendent meaning, such as a predetermined child of light, these interpretations transform unresolved uncertainty into something that feels interpretable, even if it remains unverifiable. The most influential branch of this narrative links the sacrifice theory to the idea of extending the lifespan of top leadership, most notably through interpretations involving Xi Jinping. At first glance, this supplies what the theory otherwise lacks: a concrete beneficiary and therefore a sense of closure. But this linkage collapses under structural scrutiny. Historically, sacrificial systems, whether in the Shang dynasty or the Aztec civilization, were public, collective practices aimed at maintaining perceived higher order and reinforcing legitimacy through shared participation. By contrast, traditional Chinese metaphysical practices such as feng shui and fortune calculation operate on an entirely different axis: individual fate adjustment, risk avoidance, and personal optimization. These are not variations of one system, but fundamentally distinct domains, collective versus individual. Their direct fusion into a life extension sacrifice narrative signals not hidden structure, but interpretive breakdown. Under the pressure of uncertainty, observers tend to assemble available symbolic fragments into a coherent story, even when those fragments originate from incompatible systems. Political anecdotes, circulating remarks, and familiar cultural ideas about fate and longevity are compressed into a single narrative that feels meaningful but lacks internal coherence. What emerges is not evidence, but a constructed explanation designed to resolve ambiguity. This dynamic also produces an unintended irony. If the broader narrative framework was meant to diffuse responsibility and avoid implicating the highest level of power, then the emergence of a theory centered on extending Xi Jinping's lifespan represents a clear deviation. Once in the public domain, symbolic narratives escape control and are continuously reinterpreted according to audience biases. In this case, the mechanism intended to disperse attention instead amplified unrelated fragments, generating speculation beyond its original scope. This effect was likely intensified by the circulation of audio in which Xi Jinping mentioned living to 150 years old in a conversation with Vladimir Putin, material that surfaced roughly a week before Yu Menglong's death. The temporal proximity made it easy to fuse these unrelated elements, accelerating the spread of a sacrifice for extended life narrative that rapidly took on its own momentum. From this perspective, the life extension sacrifice interpretation does not strengthen the sacrifice theory, it undermines it. It shows that the theory is sustained by recombination of symbols within an information vacuum. As these narratives proliferate, attention drifts further from concrete facts into a self-reinforcing cycle of interpretation. This is how the black hole of conspiracy theories forms, through the absence of reliable information combined with the human impulse to impose meaning on uncertainty. A narrative that cannot be verified also cannot be definitively challenged. It sustains endless debate while diverting attention away from lines of inquiry that might lead to accountability. The focus shifts from what happened to what does it mean, and with that shift, the possibility of a definitive answer gradually recedes. For this reason, the incorporation of Xi Jinping extending life into the sacrifice theory is better understood as a product of interpretive pressure rather than a coherent element of any original design. It reflects the tendency to merge familiar symbolic fragments into a unified explanation, even when they originate from incompatible systems. This returns us to the central question: if we adopt the blood chamber framework and interpret "a whale falls, all things are born" as a metaphor for sacrificing an individual in exchange for the prosperity of the industry, does that interpretation actually hold? In practice, it does not. Following Yu Menglong's death, the entertainment industry did not experience renewal, but contraction. Calls to ban entertainment and boycott domestic productions spread rapidly. Brands withdrew, projects stalled, and opportunities shrank. The industry entered a deep freeze. Audiences responded with distrust and disengagement, leading to declining monetization, collapsing commercial value, and eroded confidence across the sector. The metaphor's promise and reality stand in stark opposition. At a deeper level, such symbolism originates in visible collective rituals that derive legitimacy from their public nature and their role in maintaining a broader social or cosmic order. Here, it is repurposed to frame a concealed, individualized act. Rather than reinforcing order, it produces uncertainty and fear. This inversion strips the metaphor of coherence. It cannot account for how the destruction of one individual would yield collective flourishing, nor can it justify recasting secrecy as a form of higher necessity. Seen in this light, a whale falls, all things are born, operates less as an explanation than as a constructed smokescreen. Internally, it conveys intimidation, framing silence as a shared condition. Externally, it diverts attention by offering a narrative that feels profound, yet resists verification. Its effectiveness lies in this ambiguity. By presenting an interpretation that appears complete but cannot be tested, it shifts focus away from evidence and into a space where speculation displaces investigation. By the same logic, the sacrifice theory appears less as an organic conclusion than as the endpoint of a guided process. Its function is not to persuade, but to blur the boundary between truth and speculation. Once discourse is drawn into an inherently unprovable framework, the incentive to pursue concrete evidence weakens. In this way, concealment is maintained by steering the direction of discussion, often more effectively than attempting to shut it down outright. A further question follows: who has the capacity to design and sustain a framework of this complexity over time? Examined closely, these layered arrangements point to a consistent underlying logic, aligned with existing power structures and characterized by a high degree of instrumental rationality. Within this logic, actions are evaluated primarily by their function in maintaining systemic stability. When expressed through symbolic or aesthetic forms, this logic takes shape as narratives in which individual loss is framed as serving a broader order. Once embedded in cultural production, it often manifests as a form of fatalism. Suffering is individualized and even aestheticized as growth, while structural conditions remain unexamined. Among figures associated, directly or indirectly, with unresolved incidents in the entertainment industry, one name that recurs in related discussions is Yi Shu. Based on the patterns outlined above, it is reasonable to assess a higher likelihood of involvement or influence than of complete absence, while emphasizing that this remains an analytical inference rather than a definitive conclusion. The reasoning behind this assessment will be explored in the next episode, where the focus shifts from structural patterns to the question of individual roles. If you find this analysis useful, you can support its continued development by sharing it more widely.